I just shake my head at that. I'm like, only at the journey do we show Office Space before I preach. I got to be honest, when I decided to be a pastor, I never in my mind envisioned that the Office Space would precede some sermon that I would be doing. But here we are, gathered together again as we are in this sermon series called Truth Unraveled. And if you have been in and out throughout the summer, what we've been doing is looking at the book of Proverbs. And one of the profound things about the book of Proverbs is what it allows us to do is really seek the Lord on what it practically looks like to live our lives every day, to really confront the issues of our day. And so one of the things that we said over and over again in this series is that what Proverbs allows us to do is it allows us to really leave the church and really enter into the world and to see that God specifically has called us into places, into issues, into people, and to really seek Him and to understand what that means. And so today what we're going to be addressing, as you just saw in the video that we watched, we're going to be addressing the issue of work. And work is a significant issue in our day because it is a way that we spend the majority of our time. And I think it's important today as I talk about work just to name this, that as we address work, I'm not only talking about what is your job, right? Because that is a limited view of really what work can be and even the way that we need to talk about it. Work can be really what gives you purpose in your life, where do you invest your time, who are the people that you are around. And so your work might be being a parent. Your work right now might be being a student and preparing for a job. Maybe you're here today and you're retired and you say, well, I'm not doing a job, but where are you investing your time and what are the priorities that you have? See, work, if we're going to get into this text today, is going to be significant for us to really think about and reflect on is because we are very confused when it comes to what our work is supposed to be and even what we're supposed to be getting from it. In preparation for this sermon, I was reading an article on businessinsider.com, and the article was 20 disturbing statistics about our work. And I just wanted to highlight a few of these to show you the confusion that we probably have as a culture. One of the things that it said was, on average, in our lifetime, people typically spend about 90,000 hours working. It's a lot of time, right? That might even feel overwhelming for you if you're on the front end of your career right now. But even beyond that, what a lot of statistics showed was that about 80% of people are dissatisfied in their work. So think about that, right? This is something that we do a lot of our time with, and yet we're not really happy with where and how we're spending it. Even beyond that, what a lot of statistics show was that couples in which one of the spouses works 10 plus hours beyond what really they're being asked to do are twice as likely to be divorced, right? They're investing more time in their work, more of their identity in their work than the relationships that they're in. On average, if you right now are younger in this room, maybe you're in college right now and you're kind of asking that question, what am I going to do with my life? What a lot of statistics will show is you don't really know the answer and you're not going to know that answer over time, right? Because by the time that most people get to the age of 30, they've already changed jobs about 7 or 8 times. We don't even really know what we want to do. But here's what's really interesting about work, is that as much time as it consumes, for many of us, we don't really know how to get away from it. On average, Americans only use about 57% of their vacation time. So this is time that has been legally given to you to go do something besides work, and most people don't do it. But even the people who go on vacation, for them, 25% of those people check into their work every day. And if it's a holiday, about 59% of those people even check into their work when they probably should be doing something else. See, what we need to understand about work and the significance of work is this. It takes a lot of time. We don't really enjoy it, but we don't really know how to get away from it. And the question that I would just ask for us today, and it's a good question to just have in the back of your mind, is this really what God intended our work to be? Did God really intend for us to be people who were so dissatisfied, so confused, longing for something else to be a part of our lives? And so as we address the book of Proverbs, and specifically as we address Proverbs 6, there's really 3 things that I want to talk about today. First, I want to talk about the purpose of work. What was God's intention for work if you go all the way back to the beginning of Scripture? But then I want to talk about some of the problems that we oftentimes face in our work. What prevents us from enjoying the things that God intended in our lives? And then the third thing I want to talk about is what are some new possibilities that we might have for the work that we do. So let's start with just what is the purpose of work? And if you want, you can flip to Genesis 1, or you can just kind of take me at my word, because I'm going to kind of highlight a few things and go through it really quickly. But if you go back to Genesis 1, which is the first chapter in the Bible, this is what Genesis 1 tells us about work. That in the beginning, God created. And it gives us this list of all these things that God creates. He creates heaven and earth. He creates the moon, the sun, and the stars. He creates the sky and the sea. He creates animals and plants. And then towards the ends of Genesis 1, it tells us that he creates man and woman. And the thing that we've got to understand before we even talk about ourselves is that the very nature and character of who God is that God was a worker. God is going to demonstrate himself as a worker at the beginning of Scripture. In Genesis 2, God is going to describe himself as a gardener who waters the plants. He goes on in Genesis 2, and he says that he fashions Adam and Eve together. If you read the Psalms, which are filled of God describing himself as a worker, in Psalm 19, he describes his creation as his handiwork. In Psalm 104, God again describes himself as a gardener who nurtures and waters plants. In Psalm 107, God is known for his wonderful works to the Son of Men. See, this is an attribute and a quality that God describes himself over and over again, that I am a worker. God even gives himself titles as being a worker. If you read Scripture, God describes himself over and over again by different titles. Here's just a few. He's described as a metal worker, as a potter, as a garment maker. In Isaiah 66:13, he describes himself as a merciful and comforting mother. He's a composer, a performer, a farmer, a shepherd, a builder. See, what the Bible shows us about God is that God is the most blue-collar worker there's ever been. Like, God is the epitome of the jack of all trades. That's the very character and the nature of who he is. But it's not just that God is a worker. God also commissions his creation, specifically Adam and Eve, to work. If you read Genesis 1:28, this is what God says in there. He says to Adam and Eve, after he makes them, he then says, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and every living thing that moves on earth." See, upon creating Adam and Eve, God then commissions Adam and Eve to work. He tells them to go and to fill the earth, to subdue the earth, to use the gifts that you have. See, here's why this is important. Because after God commissions Adam and Eve to work, he then in Genesis 1:29 says this, "I look at all of my creation, I look at Adam and Eve, and I look at the work that I've commissioned them to do, and this is what I declare over all of it. It is good." That work at its core is good. Here's why that's important. That is not the way that we oftentimes talk about work. If you think about the way that we oftentimes talk about work, we talk about work almost as if it's a necessary evil, right? Like, this is just something that I have to do. Or sometimes even in the church, we talk about work almost as if it's a consequence of sin. That like, all of a sudden sin happened, then people had to work. But what we see is that before sin ever came into the world, that God commissions Adam and Eve to work, and that work is good. Tim Keller says it this way, and I think this is a profound way of breaking this down. He says, work is as much a basic human need as food, beauty, rest, friendship, prayer, and sexuality. It's not simply medicine, but food for our soul. See, at the very fabric of who we are, of the existence that God created for us, is that God created us to be people who work. Have you thought about that before? Do you approach your job that way? And here's what's amazing about God in Genesis 1 and 2. God didn't just commission Adam and Eve to work for the sake of working, but he gave them a specific task to do. If you go back to Genesis 1:28, what is he asking them to do? To fill the earth and subdue it. If you go on in Genesis 2, in Genesis 2:15, God goes to Adam and he says, "I'm going to put you in the garden and I want you to work it and keep it." In Genesis 2:19 and 20, he then goes to Adam again and he says, "Adam, I have a very special project for you. I want you to find all the animals and I want you to give them a name." See, what God is doing for both Adam and Eve is this. He's saying, here's what I want your work to be about. One, I want your work to be a place where you can discover the unique gifts that I've given you to do. Right? That God is looking at Adam and Eve, God is looking at you and me, and he's saying this, I have uniquely gifted all of you to do things that are very special and important. And part of the reason why I commission you to work is to help you to discover those gifts. But even as I call you to fill the earth and subdue it, what I'm basically saying to you is this, that my world is just a big playground. And in my playground, I've given you resources and opportunities to discover and to cultivate and to create and to understand who I am. And so part of the purpose of work is this, that we would actually discover gifts that God's given to us. And as we discover those gifts, that we would experience joy by using those gifts. And as we experience joy in using those gifts, that it would actually lead us to a place of worshiping God and experiencing His glory. When was the last time you were at your job and you found joy in discovering something that you didn't know before? When was the last time that you discovered, wow, I can do something that I didn't realize that I could do, and remembering those moments of what brought you joy? See, this is where children become really important for us, because kids understand joy in a way that we as adults oftentimes lose sight of. Even this week, my wife and I were able to experience this. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and we have been going to the pool a lot this summer, right? Especially this week. It has been hot. And so we've been going to the pool, and we've been trying to help our daughter learn how to swim. And she's had like hits or misses. It's been starting and stopping. She's been really scared to go underwater. But for whatever reason, this Monday, she just decided she would learn how to swim. And she gets in the pool, she gets in the water, she puts some goggles on, she pushes off the wall, and she starts swimming to my wife. And she comes out of the water, and she's immediately filled with joy. Why? Because she realized she could do something that she didn't know that she could do. She discovered something both about herself, but also the world that she didn't even know was possible. See, that's the beauty of kids, is that kids demonstrate that on a daily basis. But oftentimes we go in our jobs and we discover things or we do things and we just treat it matter-of-factly. See, God in the garden said that work is good, that work is a way that you can discover your gifts, and work is a way that you can experience my joy. Now, my guess is that for some of us, that's not the attitude that we're maybe going to walk into on Monday morning. Right? Like when we go to our jobs on Monday morning, we're not like, man, I'm so happy I get to do something to experience joy and have fun, and I get to experience the glory of God, and man, what a great worship opportunity for me today. Right? Like that's not the way that we approach our work, and yet that's what God's intention for work was supposed to be before sin and brokenness entered into this world. So the question for us this morning is this: why can't we experience God's joy, God's gifting, and even worship through what we do? And I think our passage in Proverbs 6 actually gives us an idea of where many of us struggle. And so if you would look at this passage in Proverbs 6, we're going to start in verse 9. But before I get there, here's what I would say. Here's the problem that many of us face in our work. It's one of two things. For some of us, our problem, and this is what we're going to see in this text, is we struggle with idleness. That we just struggle with just being idle people, lacking motivation, and lacking any sort of effort to do the things that God's put in front of us. But the other end of the spectrum that we kind of fall into is we've fallen into the spectrum of and the struggle with idolatry. So I want you to think about this through this lens. Am I somebody in my work who struggles with idleness, or am I somebody in my work who struggles with idolatry? So let's look at this text and let's see what the problem is. So in verse 9 it says this: "How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man." See, here's what this passage is warning us, and this is a warning that the author of Proverbs is trying to communicate to us. The warning is this: that we as people are prone to idleness. We as people are prone to be individuals who lack motivation to do something. And on some level, what this passage is addressing is physical laziness. Right? It's saying that there's some of us that we are just physically lazy, that we don't take responsibility for the things that we're supposed to do, and there's major consequences that come from it. But what I would argue with you this morning is it's a little bit deeper than just physical laziness. See, I've never met a person who by admission just said, hey, I'm a physically lazy person. right? That's not oftentimes the way that we identify ourselves. But here's what I would ask you this morning. Where in your life do you lack motivation, and where in your life are you easily distracted? Where in your life do you lack motivation, and where in your life are you easily distracted? I was reading an article recently in the New York Times, and the article talked about how we have become a culture of distraction. We are distracted all the time, and one of the things that it said in there that I was blown away by was, on average, American adults spend 5 hours a day watching TV. That's what a lot of the average statistics show. Beyond that, it said that a lot of Americans spend about 2 hours a day on social media, right? We're just always on our phones. We're always on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, just kind of seeing what else is going on in the world. I then clicked an article that was attached to it that was in Forbes magazine, and the article talked about how many people are prone to just waste time in their jobs, right? Like, does this ever happen to you? You go to your job and you're like, what can I do to waste as much time as I want? And when they were writing the article, they said this, that 59% of people that they surveyed admitted that they wasted 1 to 2 hours a day in their work. Right? That it was like, here's time you're being paid to work, and you were doing something else. You're shopping online, you're texting your friends, you're talking to your coworkers, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. See, what the author of Proverbs is getting at is many of us are not just prone to just be only lazy people, but we're prone to be distracted. And the distractions that we live by have huge consequences. And the consequence is this. Oftentimes we believe the things that we're doing or distracting ourselves with are not that big of a deal. Right? They seem very inconsequential, and yet the consequences are huge. Notice how the author of Proverbs sets this thing up. What kind of slumber is it? It's a little slumber. It's a little sleep. It's a little resting of the hands. See, what it's getting at is we begin to develop habits in our lives that become lifestyles that destroy us. That same article, this is fascinating to me, that same article in the New York Times, it went on, it got worse. And here's how it got worse. It said this: if you watch 5 hours of TV a day, and you do that over the course of your lifetime, that will equate to 7 years and 9 months of your life. Whoa. I think nobody who gets to the end of the life says, man, I hope that I live a legacy of TV watching. Right? I'm the greatest Netflix binge watcher there has ever been. It said that if you spend 2 hours a day on social media, that will lead to about 5 years and 2 months of your life. That Forbes magazine article said that if you, say, at worst, waste 30 minutes a day in your job, that's 2.5 hours a week. That's 135 hours a year. See, what the articles were getting at, and I think what the author of Proverbs is trying to address, is this. A lot of times these things seem subtle and they seem inconsequential, but when they became a lifestyle and a habit for how we live and what we focus on, they become detrimental. I'll just say this, I will binge watch TV with the best of them, right? This is not an anti-TV, anti-social media message. The question is, how are we investing our time, and when are these things becoming detrimental to what we've been responsible and called to do in our lives? See, what the author of Proverbs is saying is this, that here's what happens. When these things become lifestyles, then we become people who begin to live in poverty, and our poverty comes like a robber. Now, I've been robbed twice in my life. I had my car stolen once, and I had my apartment robbed. If you've ever been robbed before, here's the way it goes down. You show up, you don't know what happened, you look around and everything is gone, and you're not really sure what you're supposed to do. And what the author of Proverbs is getting at is when these things become lifestyles, all of a sudden you're going to get to a place in your life where either you have no money, you have no opportunity, you have no relationships, and you're stuck looking around saying, what happened? How did I get here? This was never the hope that I had for my life, and yet this is where I find myself today. The other issue that many of us have with idleness, it maybe isn't physical idleness, but it's almost emotional heart idleness. So for some of us, our struggle is this, and I worry that even a lot of us feel this way in this room today. We are going to our jobs, we're doing what we're being asked to do, but there's absolutely no heart, there's no passion, and there's no meaning in the work. So what it turns into is we become people who are idle in the sense of emotionally, we show up to our jobs, we look at the clock, we count down the time, and we leave, and that's it. And that's one of the dangers, right? Because when we become people who put no effort into what we do, the impact and the consequence could be huge. When I was in high school, I had the worst job, at least that I've ever had, and I worked in a warehouse, and there was no air conditioning in this warehouse, and my job was to build furniture every day. Now, the reason why this was such a bad job is because I'm the last person you will ever want to call to help build furniture at your house. I feel bad for every person who received furniture that I made for them, right? Like my wife, every time something goes down in her house, she's like, please call somebody else. Like, do not try to do this yourself. I am not good with a hammer. I am not good with tools. It's just a hot mess. But I did this job because it gave me flexible hours. I was playing basketball at the time, and it seemed like it was the easiest thing for me to do. But here's what happened. Over time, when I went into this job, this is my goal. I had one goal. I am going to make it look like I'm working as hard as I possibly can without doing anything. That was my goal. So every day I would show up saying, okay, what is the bare minimum I can do while giving the appearance like I'm working really hard? And so I would just sit there all day, daydream, talk to people, and as soon as a boss or a supervisor was near, grab the hammer, grab some nails, start putting furniture together. Like everybody else was putting like 12 to 15 pieces of furniture a day together, I averaged like 2, right? And in my mind, I was doing my job, but my heart wasn't really there. So are you a person who is prone to idleness? Do you even find yourself lacking motivation in the work that you're doing? There's a warning being given to us. It can be consequential to your life and to the things that you've been called to do. But the other end of the spectrum, which Proverbs doesn't really address, but we see this addressed in other parts of Scripture, the other problem some of us fall into is our work has become a source of idolatry. Our work has become the center of our identity. If you've been around the journey long enough, we talk about idolatry quite a bit. And the way that we oftentimes talk about idolatry is typically something that is good that we've elevated and put in the place of God, right? That we have now worshiped instead of God. So in this context, it would be we've taken our jobs, which can be good things, and we worship our jobs. We spend all our time in our jobs. Our identity comes from our jobs rather than worshiping God and finding our identity in Him. So are you somebody who's sitting here today that says, my hope, my value, my worth rests in what I do? That really I have nothing else to talk about in my life other than my work. See, we are a culture that is prone to do this. Think about the way that we introduce ourselves to each other. What's the first question we ask? What do you do? What are we asking in that question? We're really trying to ask the question, who are you? But what we've done is we have ascribed to people their worth and their value, their dignity by the things that they do, not actually who they are. And so in preparation for this sermon, I was reading a book called The Gospel at Work, and it was addressing this issue of idolatry. And it said, these are the 3 biggest indicators that you struggle with idolatry in your work. So I want to give them to you, and I want you to kind of use this as a test. Is this you? Are you falling into this trap? Is any of this language sound familiar? Here's what it said. Here's the first evidence that you struggle with idolatry in your work. Number 1, your work is the primary source of your satisfaction. Your work is the primary source of your satisfaction. So here's what this means. Your mood, your temperament, your attitude, and your outlook on life is contingent upon either what you do or what you produce or how much you make. So the idea of it is that every time you step into your work, your reputation is on the line depending on what people say about you or what happens. So it might be a performance review. It might be the way that your kids are behaving. It might be the things that people are saying about you. That if you find your worth based on what those things say about you, there's a very good indication that you struggle with idolatry. I'll explain how this works in my own life. You're going to see a pattern really quick that I struggle a lot with identity and idolatry in my work. You're going to find out a lot about me right now. But one of the ways I saw this clearly manifest itself in my life was this. A couple years ago, I was working at another place, and on a Monday, somebody came up to me. They said, hey, Tim, I just want to encourage you. This is what they said. I think that you're the best thing that's ever happened to this place. That you've done so many great things, and I appreciate your leadership and the decisions that you've made and the way that you're changing this culture. So I remember going home that night, and my wife and I were having dinner. I'm like, gosh, look at what somebody said. Like, I'm so excited. I knew God was using me. Isn't this so exciting? This is great to be at a place where my gifts are being used and God is getting glory. 3 days later, and I'm not kidding you, 3 days later, somebody else came up to me. Said, hey, Tim, I want to talk to you. I'm really frustrated by your leadership. I think you're making terrible decisions. I am struggling to follow you, and I don't really agree with anything that you've done at this point. Oh, just a gut punch. Here's just a helpful hint. If you need to rebuke someone, find a gentler way to rebuke someone. But I went home that night. I kid you not. My wife and I have dinner again. I went home, and this is what I said to my wife. I got to find a new job. Like, I'm terrible at this. Like, why is God not calling me out of this place? I got to go do something else. This is terrible. I knew this was a mistake. And my wife, who has to just deal with me a lot, just looked at me quietly and she said, Tim, you want to know the truth? Here's the truth. Neither one of those things are true. You're not as good as people think you are, and you're also not as bad as other people might suggest. Neither one of them is true. But what for me I found was my identity, my hope, my satisfaction came in what people said about me. It's a sign of idolatry. Here's the second one, is your work is about being your best so that you can make a name for yourself. So here's what it means, that your job, your work, whatever it is that you invest your time in, it's all about you. It's about your name. It's about your success. It's about your platform. It's about your salary. It's about your kids. It's about your relationships. It's using people and using things to make much of yourself. So oftentimes the way that this manifests itself is that if you're a person who struggles with this sort of idolatry, number one, you're a very competitive person. So everybody is a means to an end. Everybody is somebody that you can step over in order for you to exceed and be successful. But beyond that, the way that most people struggle with this is that for you, achievement is never enough. That you are never satisfied, that you could say, if only I made this amount of money, if only my kids behaved in this certain way, if only I had this type of house, if only I had this type of job, then I would be happy. But the truth and the lie of it is you're never going to be happy as long as your identity is in making a name for yourself. Several years ago, I also, at the same place, won this award for teaching. And at the time, it felt like it was a really big deal. And remember going to my counselor several days after I won this award, and I sat down with my counselor, and here's what he said to me. Tim, number one, I'm really excited for you. I'm really proud of you, man. That's a really big deal. But can I tell you something? And I'm like, oh, no. Like anytime a counselor says, can I tell you something? It's bad news. Here's what he said. I'm really sad for you. I'm really sad. I was like, well, why are you sad for me? He said, here's why, because I know the way that your heart works, and I know the way your mind thinks. And rather than finding joy and resting in where God has you and resting in what God's done, already what you're doing in your mind is you're saying, okay, how can I do more? How can I achieve more? How can I validate this award that I've won? And he said, the sad thing for you, Tim, that I think that you don't understand a lot of times is this. Achievement is an addiction for you. Achievement is like a drug for you. And so you get a little bit of a high, and then it wears off, and then you got to get a little bit more. And so you do more and more and more and more, and you wear yourself out because you feel like it's never enough. Is that you? Are you chasing some lie of achievement and success and status and wealth that at the end of the day is never going to satisfy you? Because we know that it's not going to satisfy us, but we chase it. Here's the third one. I'll say this a little bit quicker. That your work only, and the key word here is only, is about making a difference in the world. See, one of the things that we oftentimes do is we almost create this all or nothing proposition. And here's the all or nothing proposition. If I'm not having a direct impact on people's lives in the world, then my job is worthless. Right? So if I'm not doing something big or doing something incredible, or I don't see hearts and lives change through the spreadsheet that I've created, then the spreadsheet that I've created and the job that I have is not worth my time. So what we do is we almost minimize the work that God's called us to do. We minimize the way that we're gifted because we think that we're supposed to be something that we're not. So several months ago, I was on vacation. I was reading the Steve Jobs biography. I don't know if anyone's ever read that book. Fascinating book, fascinating man. Here's how most people should read that book. They read and they say, oh, this is an interesting story. Here's how I read that book. I read it, and I read about all these things that Steve Jobs did, all these industries that he's changed, and I am just overwhelmed by this sense of shame and overwhelmed by this sense of, man, what am I doing with my life? This guy's changing the world. What am I doing? Lord, I need to go do something else. I need to do something bigger. I need to have more impact. And I buy into this lie, and that causes me to not to be satisfied in what God's gifted me to do and where God's called me to be and what God has called me to enter into. Are you somebody who's created an all or nothing proposition in your work? Are you somebody who right now can't even decide what you want to do with your life because you're not satisfied and feel like you have to do more? It might be a sign of idolatry. And so the question is this: if these are the two ends of the spectrum that we oftentimes live in, that we oftentimes struggle with, is this really the way that it has to be? Like, is this really the way that God intended us to live our lives? And I think that the author of Proverbs, I think that God's word, and I think even what we can all rest in today is the answer is no, that it doesn't have to be this way. So what is another way that we can almost go back to Genesis 1, go back to Genesis 2, and find hope? Well, in our text, we have the sluggard, but we're also introduced to this ant. And I think that this ant actually gives us a picture of who we can be in our work and what it can become and where we can actually find joy in life and the things that we do. If you have your Bibles again, look at verse 7 and let's read about the ant and let's see what this says about our friend, the ant. It says, without having any chief, officer, or ruler, she prepares her bread in the summer and she gathers her food in the harvest. So here's the first thing that we can take away. Without any chief, ruler, or officer, the ant is still motivated to work. What that means is the ant's work is not contingent upon people seeing her being known. There's a different motivation that she has. There's a motivation beyond the people around her or the platform that she's given to be able to work and do the things that she's called to do. So what we have to realize as a church and as individuals is this, that before you're called to your job, you're called to Jesus. Before you're called to your job, you're called to Jesus. See, a lot of times when we talk about calling, we almost do it exclusively through the lens of vocation, through work, through parenting. But before any of that is true, our primary calling has to be in Jesus, and if it's not, the whole thing comes crashing down. See, here's how the gospel frees us and gives us a different motivation that is beyond anything that this world can. See, where the world says, work harder, try more, be better in order to be accepted, what Jesus tells us is this, that I came down for you even though you didn't deserve it, that I went to the cross on your behalf even when you should be the one who's being punished, and I did it because I love you. And the truth and the promise of my gospel is this, that because I went to the cross for you, because of my resurrection, you can rest assured that you are fully loved, that you're fully forgiven, and that I have fully approved of who you are. See, that's the promise of the gospel that we have to remind ourselves of over and over again. In Romans 8, Jesus tells us that because of his death that we are now heirs to God, meaning that we have received an inheritance. In 1 John 3, he tells us that we are now God's children. And so where the world says, try harder, be better, do more, Jesus is saying, I've already done it, rest in me, you're accepted. See, that is why we have to preach and remember the gospel every single day, because we have to have that as the foundation for who we are and how we live. Martin Luther once famously said, the reason why we need the gospel every day is because we forget the gospel every day. We can't just receive the gospel when we show up to church on Sunday morning. We have to receive the gospel every day in our lives. So one of the things that I've had to change about my life is every day when I wake up, I have to pray this prayer. And I would encourage you, if you struggle with some of this, to take this and to allow it to be your prayer. I pray this every morning. God, help me to believe that my reputation is not on the line today. Help me to believe that no matter what room I walk into, no matter what people say, either good or bad, that I've already been accepted by you. And God, I pray that when I step into my work today, when my family today, and my friendship today, that number one, that you would help me to stop thinking so much of myself, that I would rest in what you've already promised to me, that you would allow me to worship you and see other people. See, the truth is this, if your identity is in what you do, then all you think about is you. That when you rest and become motivated in Jesus, then you stop worrying about yourself, and it gives you the ability both to worship God and to see other people. So Jesus gives us a new motivation to say, I can rest because he's already promised it to me. The second thing that it does is it gives us a new focus. So notice what the ant is doing. The ant is preparing bread and gathering food. Now, I am not either a preparer or a gatherer. That's not qualities that you would use to describe me, and it's probably not qualities we would use to describe you. But here's what I know about preparing and gathering food. It's hard, it takes a lot of work, and it's very strenuous, right? And I think that sometimes the misconception that we buy into as Christians is this: if I've been accepted by Jesus, if I've been forgiven by Jesus, then I can just coast until I go to heaven. I can just kind of ride this thing out until the end, and really what I do in this earth is somewhat inconsequential. And yet what I think the ant is demonstrating to us is this: that if you are called into work, once you understand your calling to Jesus, then you're actually called to do good, hard work. There's a woman named Dorothy Sayers, and she wrote this book about work, and I want you to hear what she says. This is amazing, and it's a little bit longer, but I think it's such a clear picture of who God calls us to be and how the church oftentimes gets this wrong. She says, the church's approach to an intelligent carpenter is usually confined to exhorting him not to be drunk and disorderly in his leisure hours and to come to church on Sundays. What the church should be telling him is this: the very first demand that his religion makes upon him is that he should make good tables. Church, by all means, and decent forms of amusement, certainly, but what use is all of that if in the very center of his life and occupation he's insulting God with bad carpentry? No crooked table legs or ill-fitting drawers ever, I dare swear, came out of the carpenter's shop in Nazareth. Nor if they did, could anyone believe that they would be made by the same hand that made heaven and earth. No piety in the worker will compensate for work that is not true to itself, for any work that is untrue to its own technique is a living lie. Here's what she's saying: that most of the time when we talk about in the church personal holiness and obedience to God, our message to you becomes, hey, this week if you want to live for God, don't get drunk and don't get in a fight. But what she's getting at is this: that what we should be instructing each other to do is use the gifts that God's given you and work hard and do good work. Because it's through your good work and it's by working with integrity that you're actually both able to worship God, serve other people, and point people to His glory. C.S. Lewis says it this way. He says that we need profane Christians that are out of the church and into the marketplace. People who don't just see their work as who they are in Jesus on Sunday, but Monday through Friday as well. If you want to serve God, if you want to worship God, it's not only when we're in here. It's when we're scattered out there, and it's when we're in our work. The last thing that we're called to do that the ant shows us is this: that we would actually be people who also rest. See, this is profound. The ant is gathering food and preparing bread so that the ant can then store the food up so that the ant could actually enter into a season of rest. See, when we read this text, it can be almost easy for us to hear about the sluggard, at least this is what I do, and want to run to the complete opposite side. Like the worst thing you could label me as is lazy or sluggard, so I'm just going to pour myself into what I do so I can really be seen as a hard worker at the cost of actually living in obedience to who God's called me to be, which is to be a person who rests. See, God calls us to work hard, to worship Him in our work, but also to rest well. There's an author named Henry Blocher, and one of the things that he says is oftentimes when we read Genesis 1, we almost treat the climax of Genesis 1 as God creating an Adam and Eve and then God commissioning the work. He said, you want to know the climax of Genesis 1? It's God commanded them to rest. Do you know that God commanded you to rest? That God commanded you to stop working, that God commanded you to go on vacation, that God commanded you to stop the things that you're doing and allowing that to be the center of your life and to leave it and to actually enjoy things outside of your work. What a beautiful thing that is. Like God actually calls us to have hobbies and friendships and not allow our work to be the center of who we are. If you ever want to experience something humbling, go on vacation. Here's what's humbling about going on vacation, at least for me. When I go on vacation, life goes on. When I go on vacation, the journey moves forward. And I come back, and almost disheartenedly, I'm like, did anybody miss me? Like, is anybody even aware that I was gone? I guess you guys got this. But you know what's good about that? Here's what's good about it. it reminds me that I'm limited. And in my limitation, it reminds me that when I am able to rest, God is still at work. See, our rest brings us to a place of worship because when we rest, we realize, I can't do this, and yet, God, you are still doing it. So God does call us to rest. God does call us to step away, and as we rest, God calls us to experience joy in Him. So our question for this morning is this: what does it look like for us to become Genesis 1 and 2 people in our work? What does it look like for us to actually look at the things that God has given us to do and to say, it is good, I am finding joy in the gifts that He's given me and the place that He's in, and also I can rest because my hope and my identity is in who Jesus already declared me to be, not in what my work says about me, and therefore it can lead me to a life of worship. That's God's intention for your life, that it's not just the gospel as Jesus died for me, it's that as Jesus has died for me, now I can rest in Him. I got to get a glimpse of this last night, and I'll just close real quickly with this. So here's what's amazing about last night. I preach a sermon, and I leave and I go home, and I walk through the front door. And when I walk through the front door, both of my kids are still awake. I have a 4-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. You know what they do? They run immediately up to me, and they scream at the top of their lungs, "Dad!" Kind of like Buddy the Elf, if you've ever seen that movie, like, "Santa!" They come up, and they run up and they give me the biggest hug in the world. They say, "Dad, we're so glad that you're home." They say, "Dad, will you come play with us? Dad, will you come hang out with us? Dad, will you go and tell me a story?" And here's what's amazing about my kids. They didn't care how good my sermon was. They don't care that I'm a pastor. They care that I'm their dad. They care that I'm present with them. And I think in so many ways, that's the way that Jesus looks at us. Is that we're always measuring ourselves. Did I do good enough work? Was it enough for you? And Jesus is just saying, I'm just glad you're home. I'm just glad you're here. I'm just glad that you're in my presence. And my prayer oftentimes for my own life and for this church is that we would be people that would rest in the fact that Jesus already delights in us. We don't have to do anything. And because He delights in us, that we can rest and worship Him. Let's pray. Father God, so oftentimes it is easy for us to lack motivation, to lack heart, but at the same time to put so much of our identity in what we do. So Lord, I pray that we would be people who would repent. Lord, recognizing that we are prone to place our hope and our trust in ourselves and what we do rather than our hope and our trust in You. And Lord, I pray that we would see that You are a good dad who delights in His children. Lord, that You are not measuring us and wondering, are we good enough? Lord, that You've already declared that we are enough because of Your Son, Jesus. So Lord, I pray for my brothers and sisters. I pray for myself that we would find rest in You. And I pray this in Your Son's name. Amen.